Well, welcome to our final paired session. I'm going to introduce our two speakers, and then perhaps what we'll do is we'll do what we've done previously. We'll just have two 30-minute talks and then 30 minutes of questions. So our first speaker is Professor Catherine Keller. Catherine is Professor of Constructive Theology at the Theological School of Drew University. In her teaching, lecturing, and writing, she develops the relational potential of a theology of becoming. Her books reconfigure ancient symbols of divinity for the sake of a planetary conviviality, a life together across vast webs of difference. Thriving in the interplay of ecological and gender politics, of process cosmology, post-structuralist philosophy, and religious pluralism, her work is both deconstructive and constructive in strategy. She is currently finishing Cloud of the Impossible, Theological Entanglements, which explores the relation of mystical unknowing, material indeterminacy, and ontological interdependence. Our second speaker is Professor Michael Halewood.
I'm not professor yet, technically.
In the American sense.
Sense.
Michael Halewood is a senior lecturer at the University of Essex. His research covers the intersection between philosophy and social theory. And he's written on topics such as the concept of the social and its relation to the natural, the body, sexual difference, contemporary theorizations of subjectivity and materiality, and the work of Marx, Gilles Deleuze, Judith Butler, and John Dewey. His last book, A.N. Whitehead and Social Theory, Tracing a Culture of Thought, has recently been reprinted in paperback. His new book, Rethinking the Social, is due out in autumn 2014.
It's out. It's out.
It's out now.
Yeah, it was out on Monday.
With a cool cover.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So my wish for this little book, actually, I need to say good morning. Good morning. Some of you are fresh faces here, and I'm delighted you're here. Altering the whole mix of our symbolic reference across complex and mounting causal efficacies. Okay, I'm not going to meditate, though, on how your presentationally immediate faces enter into the mix. So my wish for this serene little booklet from 1927 was this, that it might yield a clue as to how symbols can better help to stir consciousness about climate catastrophe. Now, Whitehead had the wreckage of war and of revolutions in mind when he wrote the book, not the wreck of the whole habitable Earth, which tends to recover from wars and revolutions. Still, I was hoping for some wisp of prophecy, camouflaged by his Victorian charm, but actually this rather tightly wrapped little text was not springing open for me. Just as I might have despaired, having only a couple of days left in which to write the paper, I bumped into a recent study of people's perceptions of changing weather. And suddenly, the relevance of symbolism flared into view. No doubt, quickly, symbolically referred to me under pressure. But what comes to light through this study is neither theoretically straightforward, nor actually practically reassuring at all. The study's conclusion seemed, however, to cry out for a Whiteheadian interpretation, and now I could focus my questions for our conversation about symbolism. If this study does illustrate symbolism's insight into the three modes of perception, does Whitehead here help us to rethink strategies for public education about climate change? And even might the shadow question of practice falls upon the text and our reading of it. Is there time? Is there time for all this? The text asks back, what does time symbolize? Having time, being on time, within the rapidly altering space of global warming, apocalypse after all, or the chance, which I will consider today with the help of William Connolly, a possible planetary politics. So in my written version, I cited the whole bulk of that article in which I found the study. The paper is by 3 sociologists and examined people's perceptions of the winter of 2012, which was anomalously warm, the 4th warmest on record for the contiguous U.S. It analyzed people's perceptions of the warmth of the winter they had just lived through in light of the temperature anomalies that had actually occurred. The first result was not surprising. In general, people accurately did perceive that their weather had been pretty much out of whack. In places where the winter was super warm, many said as much. And the greater the deviation of winter 2012 temperatures from the 30-year winter temperature average in respondent states, the more likely that respondents report local winter temperatures to be warmer than usual, notes the paper. Right, it was warmer and they thought it was warmer. But then things got strange. What was surprising is the other factors that also shaped their assessment of actually how warm it was. The researchers found that political party affiliation had a direct effect. Democrats were more likely than Republicans to perceive local winter temperatures as warmer than usual, the paper reports. And beliefs about global warming also predicted temperature perceptions. People who were more likely to think that scientists agree about climate change or to think humans are causing the phenomenon also were more likely to report that the recent winter had been warmer than usual. The study underscores how weird this is. Your politics and climate beliefs should not change your experience of weather itself. Yet these data suggest that whether people actually physically feel differently or whether they remember and reconstruct their weather experiences differently when being asked the question, worldview is having a role. It suggests to scientists, says the article, that people have begun to filter their fundamental perceptions of what is going on, at least partly through a partisan frame. Well, that, as our discussions of the symbolic reference driving, say, police racial violence, should not be surprising. But to filter the weather through politics, and indeed filter the actual sense perceptions of the weather collected as recent memory through ideology, that seemed new to me. I remember when talk about the weather was the most innocuous kind of chit-chat that you could do with strangers. And now there's always that little, well, it's a little weird, and now it's getting weirder. What in Whiteheadian terms is then your experience of weather itself? It never would have been simple, even if it were harmless. Any such experience would always have been an instance of the 3 modes, each contributing its share of components to our individual rise into one concrete moment of human experience. So then, weather perceived in the mode of presentational immediacy would be this bright sunny surface like a screen of actual things extended in space, felt with the vividness of the sensation right now of warmth. Periunt, sparkling surface. And weather perceived in the mode of causal efficacy would entangle the long-term environment of constant shift and of emerging patterns of a new shift, experienced in a bodily, murky, primitive way, conforming us to it as the influx of the immediate past. Immediacy, unlike the variegations of presentational immediacy, it's the pressure of the actual world acting upon us, reminding us that we do not pre-exist it. The past felt affectively vague, haunting, unmanageable. Et imputantur, laid to account. So here the experiences of the weather over time would bear traces of our own individual and collective inseparability from its whole evolutionary set of vagaries and variations and our adaptations throughout the Holocene. Whitehead insistently repeats the metaphor of haunting, doesn't he, to capture this sense of material, affective relationality. I'm not going to go into the connection of his ontology to Derrida's hauntology. Surely then, It is this world disclosed in its causal efficacy, where each event infects the ages to come for good or for evil, that holds us to account for the evil of man-made, global warming. That world lends at once pathos and passion, pasco, indeed the passive moment, to the action of symbolic reference. But no such accounting is happening consciously or actively, except through the third mode of symbolic reference. Well, we all know this now after our intensive workshop together. And symbolism in Whitehead is precisely an activity, as the world it discloses in its instantly non-Kantian direct experience of causal efficacy is. That is, the world as an interplay of functional activity. The world is one great interactive practice, activity, deed, pragma. Here lies the deep pragmatism of the vision, the source of the activist intensities of process thought, especially as funneled globally through Claremont. And perhaps many have presumed something like what haunts me here in reading this study. I remember John Cobb saying to me on a walk here 30 years ago, we need enough ecological crisis to raise public consciousness, but not so much that it is too late. I realize that I have been hoping that one more Katrina or Sandy might trigger the butterfly effect of responsible public reactions and change. Certainly, the butterfly effects of climate itself, in its endlessly efficacious feedback loops of causality, are well underway. But a corresponding transformation among us has not happened. Something has gone wrong. Whitehead writes in Symbolism, symbolically conditioned action is action which is thus conditioned by the analysis of the perceptive mode of causal efficacy effected by symbolic transference from the perceptive mode of presentational immediacy. This analysis may be right or wrong, according as it does or does not conform to the actual distribution of the efficacious bodies. Insofar as it is sufficiently correct under normal circumstances, it enables an organism to conform its action to long-range analysis of the particular circumstances of its environment. One must, of course, amplify Whitehead's analysis beyond the organism to the vast human organic collective, but such a move is warranted by his own generalizations about the three revolutions. Then we infer that the needed conformation of our shared material life to the actual distribution of the efficacious bodies of the planetary collective included now in global warming, the glaciers, forests, methane spumes, drought-ridden land, acidified oceans, is not happening. The needed conformation is not happening. The long-range analysis has been available for decades and has been, as you know, confirmed by 97% scientific consensus throughout this decade. But despite the data and despite misgivings, our collective action is instead conforming with overwhelming fidelity to the dictates of neoliberal capitalism and its breathtakingly short-term analyses. What I find disturbing about that recent study on perception is that I now no longer think there's a real reason to hope that a bit more ecological crisis close to home might make the difference. Shift the swing vote, convert the critical mass, bring on that eco-democratic paradigm that's just waiting in the left wing. And well, of course, there's nothing more prone to the fallacy of misplaced concreteness than our perception of the weather. Whether in the illusion of pure succession, Hume, or of simple occurrence, Kant. But alongside of whatever is perceivable about the weather is the communication of intentional fallacies through such vivid screen immediacies of presentation as like Fox News. Nor does it here comfort me to say, well, yes, naturally, causal efficacy isn't just about the climate. We knew that already. It's massively, overwhelmingly operative through the forces of communal practices, of religious priorities, of family relations, and therefore of political ideology, in short, of reflex actions that are only with difficulty interrupted, made conscious, and reinterpreted by alternative symbolic transfers from the spatial sensorium to the haunting past in its immediate feedback loops. So perhaps it is not surprising that, as the study shows, the climate issue has become so politicized that our very perceptions of the weather are subtly slanted by political identities and cues. We already know that the frightening facts do not convince the folk who need convincing. But now we can no longer imagine that our traumatized ecology will be an efficacious ally in fighting climate denial. We cannot hope that further bodily affective local experiences of climate crisis combined with the immediate presentations of global news will help. The urgency, the militancy that fight requires might be so intensely charged politically that it might just continue to have the opposite effect of what we intend with it. So then, more empathic, local, contextually canny efforts to communicate to conservative constituencies, different vocabularies more related to their self-interests. Yet, do we have time to detach then also ecological science from politics and focus on longer-term education while undermining the science denial that religiously intensifies climate denial and indifference to this sixth extinction that's so well underway? As the new IPCC report makes so unhysterically clear, we seem to have about 30 years before we reach the warming threshold into irreversible climate catastrophe. Okay, breathe. A little Whitehead. The symbolic expression of instinctive forces drags them out into the open. It differentiates them and delineates them. There is then opportunity for reason to effect, with comparative speed, what otherwise must be left to the slow operation of the centuries amid ruin and reconstruction. We might gain the speed we need. Reason, a word we can still use when talking Whiteheadian, may here signify collective sanity, exercising symbolic reference for the common weal. And to get up to speed means dramatic transformation within what reason, at least the scientific kind, tells us is pretty much one generation. It is helpful to diagnose the problem. No, this is the question. Is it helpful, though, to diagnose the problem in terms of instinctive forces? Whitehead is trying to bring emotion into play in a new way, anticipatory of current affect theory. The common emotions that language elicits bind people together unconsciously and instinctively in conservative unquestionabilities often, while at the same time serving as the instrument of freedom, critical thinking, singular expression. His main thesis is that a social system is kept together by the blind force of instinctive actions and of instinctive emotions clustered around habits and prejudices. So isn't this sounding pretty much like the way the ideological obstruction to the reception of climate science operates upon physical perception? Or perhaps it works more precisely when read through his notion, this connection, read through his notion of reflex action as a relapse towards a more complex type of instinct. And of course, as we've discussed, neither instinct nor relapse are in themselves wrong, but perhaps, he says, unfortunate. They are unconscious reactivities. The issue is a false, wrong, symbolic analysis of causal efficacy, which in the absence of conscious attention may build up formidable habits, practices, institutions, indeed whole social orders. But Democrats and women apparently are perceiving women through a political lens that is therefore already a reflex too. Are we any less prone to be false? I think we can just note that the symbolism ground into one's lens of perception, one can just note that on the that one form of the symbolism, ground into the lens of perception, represses attention to the planetary ecology, while the other encourages it. And if by reason we mean a thinking that critically exposes habits destructive to the flourishing of all humans, and that grounds that flourishing in the transhuman universality of the earth, then Whitehead, more than any philosopher, helps us to materialize mindfully the universe of that universality, the cosmos of a cosmopolis. He notes that though reason too often fails, this is no excuse for the hysterical conclusion that it never succeeds. Okay, I'm going to calm down. I'm not going to get hysterical. He likens reason to the weak force of gravity. In the end, the creator of suns and of stellar systems. And of course, reason here is haunted by the symbol, avoided in these Virginia lectures, of the primordial nature that so reasonably exercises the gentle and often ineffectual power of persuasion. But he links it here not to slow democratic process, but to disruptive tendency due to novelties. And so to the three revolutions that make democracy possible. This cosmically slow force is, as in the initial aim, at the same time the source of radical novelty in human self-organization. Slowing down and pushing to infinite speed. So symbolically conditioned action, his term, may really get down to some action with the sense of radical novelty. The final image of symbolism, of course, welcomes indeterminate revolutionary action. It leads us to recognize that the major advances in civilization are processes which all but wreck the societies in which they occur, like unto an arrow in the hand of a child. And we love that radical gesture. And we do need new social orders. We need novel forms of self-organization of our species in its dense interplay with its living planet. Indeed, we need a planetary politics that will wreck the civilization and much of the undeniable goods that it yields so many of the neoliberal capitalism that is running the economic globe. And it cannot come about now, not on time, through democratic meandering. If it happens, it will surely happen in the impatient, militant fires of the new, a revolt carried perhaps by a generation furious at what we have done to its future. Of course, the symbolic reference that Whitehead intends, from the juvenescent spontaneity to revolutionary devastation, might misfire in our context in this time of the sixth extinction. I don't know how well it works. The unconscious recklessness of the child too well symbolizes the kind of advances that we must now somehow undo, like the rapid progress of carbon-driven industrial civilization with its now apocalyptic scale of collateral waste, monstrously childish. And nonetheless, we do need the speed, and so if the change is going to be more than academic, we need the raw risk of the arrow. So let me, in more or less closing, solicit the help of a political philosophy that rethinks time itself in acute consciousness of climate catastrophe. William Connolly has long been committed as a Deleuzian non-theist to a presumptive generosity that enables conversation with non-resentful forms of theism. His pragmatic interest in building alliances wide, diverse, and therefore plastic enough to counter what he calls the evangelical capitalist resonance machine seems to have combined with his engagement over a long period of time in biological models of complex self-organization to most recently launch him into a serious study of Whitehead, whose theism he neither ignores nor amplifies. But above all, it is his realization, Connolly's realization, of the dauntingly interlocked dynamics of neoliberal economics with climate change that drives his most recent book, The Fragility of Things, which offers a Whiteheadian rendition of what he calls temporal force fields. The chapter called Process Philosophy and Planetary Politics opens with an allusion to the Weavers singing in the 1950s, "The future's not what it used to be." This means to him that, here's a long quote, "Dangers to the human estate itself press on the horizon during an era when capitalism has intensified and when encounters between it and a variety of non-human force fields with independent powers of metamorphosis have once again become dicey." It also means that to understand those dangers and possibilities, we may need to recraft the long debate between secular, linear, and determinist images of the world on the one hand, and divinely touched, voluntarist, providential, and or punitive images on the other. Doing so to come to terms more closely with a world composed of interacting force fields set on different scales of chronotime, composing an evolving universe open to an uncertain degree. He argues that the planetary fragility of things is increasingly sensed as many protest against acknowledgement of that very sense in order to remain loyal to traditions of belonging woven into their bodies, their role performances and institutions, which I think resonates deeply with what the Whiteheadian sense of causal efficacy being lifted in symbolic reference. My paper considers with him the denial of climate change among a mass of disenfranchised folk who have had their symbolic and activity transferred by the politico-economic powers of the right. Connolly shows how economic neoliberalism is successfully manipulating our civilization through a hidden symbolism of theodicy. Global capitalism lulls its constituencies to trust in the ultimate rationality of the market. Sure, there are losses and sacrifices, but still the market guarantees the best of all possible worlds, in which its true believers will be richly rewarded in the end, at least. So Connolly is deploying Whitehead to expose that theodicy. He finds that for Whitehead, misplaced concreteness means the tendency to overlook entanglements between energized real entities that exceed any atomistic reduction of them, as when a climate pattern and ocean current system intersect and enter into a new spiral of mutual amplification, or when a cultural disposition to spiritual life befuddles the academic separation between an economic system and religion by flowing into the very fiber of work motivation, investment priorities, electoral politics. So you get a sense of his concreteness. He helps us to press toward a planetary politics. You engage, he writes, the planetary dimension of politics when you explore how ocean current flows, climate patterns, regional patterns of drought and flood, hurricane patterns, and so on, impinge upon us, and how cultural processes impinge upon them. He finds, therefore, a cosmic dimension folded into contemporary politics, and Whitehead is allowing him that new cosmological vocabulary. And he does fleetingly name this new dimension the cosmopolitan dimension. He creates thereby an opening in political theory to what I want to keep calling the cosmos of Cosmopolis. It is an opening into the spatio-temporality of the sixth extinction and of global warming, and so at the same time into what we can call perhaps a new pluritemporality of global alliance. My timing is good. I started, speaking of timing, with a discouraging study. But this fall, also, the People's Climate March, with its strong representation of peoples of color, of labor unions, of religions, performed great and hopeful symbolic action, however occluded by the politics of war in the Middle East at that very moment. It may be, writes Connolly, that those who both appreciate the fragility of things and hear a call for democratic militancy at several sites can be further energized by connecting these critiques, proposals, and actions to a beacon, and it's this beacon, this call, that is what he's unfolding in terms of what Whitehead calls the lure. And concretely, he's Connolly proposing a graded strike across several countries, perhaps leading to a general strike. He writes that to be practical here, the overriding goal is to press international organizations, states, corporations, banks, labor unions, churches, consumers, citizens, and universities to act in concerted ways to defeat neoliberalism, to curtail climate change, to reduce inequality, and to install a vibrant pluralist spirituality, this Deleuzian non-theist is saying, into democratic machines that have lost too much of their vitality. The wildly broad spectrum multiplicity of Whitehead's cosmology finds here a useful ally in the quest for a promising political concreteness. If, as Whitehead says in Symbolism, the world is a community of organisms, if we find ourselves amidst a democracy of fellow creatures, well, any slide towards hopelessness is going to perform its own symbolic action. So I suspect that we will each be heeding new lures, if not shooting new arrows, to affective materializations, multiracial, feminist, queer, eco-democratic politics, to the transgressions of disciplinary and movement boundaries, pluritemporal concrescences, coalescences, maybe even coalitions. Thanks.
I'll start over here. Every time I come to the US, I forget that I shouldn't do PowerPoint. Whereas in the UK, if you're going to, if you're going to cite, if you're going to read out quotations, they get really cross if you don't use PowerPoint to show the quotations. In the UK, they think it's arrogant to. Sorry, I mean I'm not coming here. They think no, because it's been happening for the whole conference. You know, the idea you're meant to show what you're doing, otherwise it just you've experienced this, haven't you, in the UK? When you come to the UK, people like to see. For theorists. Anyway, I'm going to start. So this is just for putting up quotations. Is it working?
Yeah.
Right, good. Right, we can go backwards.
Yeah. I can totally read half.
Unlike Catherine, my time is terrible. Is that all right? Yep. Good. Thank you, everybody. I've lost my house keys. That's why I was late. I can't find them. I'm going to have to unpack. Right. My worry is that if we focus on Whitehead's text, Symbolism, as we were asked to do for this conference, there's a risk that we might inadvertently create a sophisticated version of humanism. Such a humanism might not start with the human, might not even make the human central to our understandings of meaning, but it might let a specific version of human exceptionalism slip in through the back door. For example, if we overstate the way in which language indicates the manner that humans express themselves symbolically. Obviously, there's a link between human symbolism and language. Whitehead makes this quite clear. My point is that we need to be careful in approaching the relations between humans and symbolism. What I'm really interested in is the inhumanity which is involved in making us human. The question involved, as Isabel Stengers puts it, is of what we became when we were given speech, not what was given to us by speech. Now, in order to look at the inhumanity, which is inherent in making us what we are, as some of you may know, my wages are paid by a Department of Sociology, and so I've an interest, and a vested interest, and so is my employer, in applying Whitehead's ideas to what we might tentatively call the social world. And this is something I'm going to try and do today. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of Whitehead, some Michel Foucault, a little bit of, Roland Barthes, then Michel Foucault, and I'm going to end with my lovely, subtle but hard-headed Marxist cultural theorist, Raymond Williams. I know we spent quite a lot of time defining symbolism in Whitehead, but I'm gonna say something. I'm gonna go through it again. I think Whitehead's very careful with words, and it's worth paying attention even to very slight variations in his terms. Now, on page 1 of my version of symbolism, he states that during the Middle Ages, symbolism seemed to dominate men's imaginations. Architecture was symbolical, ceremonial was symbolical, heraldry was symbolical, but such symbolism is on the fringe of life. So I think we should take care when we're talking about symbolism. He's making a sharp but subtle distinction between symbolism and the symbolical. So sometimes I think what we're talking about is what he might think of as a symbolical, not symbolism. In the Middle Ages, symbolism seemed to dominate human imaginations, and the evidence for this still appears in the old buildings, flags, insignias which pepper Europe and its cathedrals, parliaments and universities. The mistake we should avoid is taking these too literally as examples of symbolism. They were and are elements of a kind of symbolism which interests Whitehead, but they're not its core. They're on the fringes of symbolism, of life, actually. The roots and power of symbolism lie elsewhere. He continues, click, yes. There are deeper types of symbolism, in a sense artificial, and yet such that we could not get on without them. Importantly for my argument, these deeper forms of symbolism are artificial, in a sense. They do not spring immediately from nature, whatever that might mean, yet we require them as we could not get on without them. The examples that Whitehead gives at this point are language and algebra, which seem to exemplify more fundamental types of symbolism than do the cathedrals of medieval Europe. This is not the end of the argument. He moves beyond these artificial forms of what there could be more than, to one form of symbolism which is even more fundamental. And this is the form of symbolism which is involved in perception, which Stephen talked about and everybody else has talked about. So I'm going to cut that bit, because we know that the most fundamental form is to do with some kind of perception, but we've done that. So at the same time, because I think Keith is the only person, apart from what I'm going to say, who's made a very specific point about Whitehead symbolism. So he starts by talking of, when he starts talking or defining symbolism, he does talk of the human mind. This is a few pages on, which is fair enough, as long as we remember that Whitehead has previously made clear that his aim in book Symbolism is to discuss the influence of symbolism on human life. His aim might to be focused on the relation between symbolism and human life, but this does not mean that symbolism can only be understood in terms of human life. Quite the opposite. In order to understand symbolism in human life, we have to locate symbolism in its wider context. Maintaining this distinction is not always easy, as Whitehead strays from discussions of symbolism as a wide element of existence to a closer treatment of the operations of symbolism within the human realm. Basically, I'm having a go at Whitehead because he does what he often does, is he keeps slipping between levels of discussion, between the metaphysical and then he gives an example. And you have to pay attention as you're going along and not cherry pick and just say, oh, this bit's nice, I like this, I'll apply this now. So, you know, he's annoying. No, not you, not you. It's me, I've done it for years, cherry pick Whitehead to say what I want him to. Okay, now I'm going to try and do my definition of symbolism very quickly. Symbolisms are tied up with meaning. The main point of a symbol is it means something, but what constitutes meaning? Meaning is what is elicited by a symbol, be it in terms of usage, belief, or consciousness. This is what it says. The key word here is elicited. A symbol is something which provokes a response. It produces another experience. In short, the operation of symbolism is the move from one element of experience to another. That's all it is. The first element is the symbol. The second element is the meaning of a symbol. This is a very democratic account, as Catherine pointed out. Anything can be a symbol. Anything can be a meaning. You hear the word tree, you might think of a tree. In this case, the word tree is a symbol. Our thought of a tree is a meaning. Or we could work for a tree felling company, where your role is to chop down trees. On seeing the word tree on a placard in front of an object, you move straight from seeing this to starting up your chainsaw. Conscious thought does not have to intervene. One element of experience, reading the word tree on a placard, is elicited another, for chopping down of a tree. Here, the meaning of the word tree is the chopping down of the tree. So chopping down a tree is the meaning of the placard, of what's written on the placard. Okay? It's elicited another experience in existence. We could have started with the tree, not the word tree. If we're walking through a shopping mall, you turn a corner and see unexpectedly a tree. This might elicit a response. You say, look, a tree. In this case, the tree is a symbol, and our words are the meaning of this symbol. This is what I take Whitehead to mean when he says, there are no components of experience which are only symbols or meanings. Okay. Further, why do we say word tree? That's the quotation. We've used it many times, so I'll give you a minute. I should be careful not to overstate my case, and I need to be a little more precise, otherwise Keith will tell me off. Because it might seem I'm suggesting that symbolism is simply a case of one experience being followed by another. It's not this simple or uninteresting. The two components, the symbol and the meaning, comprise one experience. There are two components in a complex experience, Whitehead said. He's moved on in his argument, though he doesn't tell us that he has. He is now talking about symbolic reference. Whitehead defines symbolic reference as the organic functioning whereby there is transition from the symbol to the meaning. And he says this will be called symbolic reference. Now, you might disagree with me, but I think it's unusual for Whitehead to provide a definition. And the fact that it does here it should alert us to the importance of a term. The symbolic reference is this active synthetic element contributed by the nature of the percipient. Note that despite Whitehead's mention of the human mind in the previous paragraph, he is now talking only of a percipient. And as he's made clear, such percipients are not limited to humans. They include dogs and tulips, at least. Okay? For symbolic reference to operate, there must be something in common between the symbol and its meaning. More than this, if something held in common produces a real ground. Symbolic reference requires a ground founded on some community between the natures of the symbol and the meaning. This is only the first step. This common ground does not mean that there will be or has to be symbolic reference. For there to be symbolic reference, the two elements, the symbol and the meaning, must be incorporated into one act of experience. Self-production through the combining of elements which were diverse into a temporary unity is for Whitehead the hallmark of existence, not just symbolism. Symbolic reference is one example of a more general aspect of reality. Humans are obviously involved in this, but they are not alone, and human symbolism is not a special or exceptional case. This is the foundation of a thoroughgoing realism, he says. It does away with any mysterious element in our experience which is merely meant. Symbols, symbolism, and meaning are not mysterious or magical in themselves, that they might elicit experiences we consider to be magical, yet such symbolism is based in reality. And when Whitehead does return to a discussion of human experience, he introduces the word objective to reinforce his point. I'm jumping. That was my definition of symbolism. Did you like it, Roland? You're looking very grumpy with me. You didn't like it? Okay. I'm going to jump now. When you're talking about symbolism, for sociologists, social theorists, you're talking about symbolism, you're talking about symbols and meanings, you need at least to mention Roland Barthes. So, because when you're talking about Barthes, then you're also talking about Ferdinand de Saussure. Okay. Now, Roland Barthes, in his important work, Mythologies, sets out to unravel and display the complex ways in which the contemporary world is suffused by signs. He builds on the work of Saussure and his distinction between the signifier and the signified. I won't go into detail here. Do we all know the difference between signifier and signified? Okay, he says, signifiers and signifieds always come together in a sign. It is the sign which we confront in the everyday world. Only in analysis do we separate them into signifier and signified. For Barthes, there is no such thing as pure denotation. You can't simply point to the world. No direct access to an objective reality. Signification and meaning are generated through and within specific social and historical situations and forces. There's no pure way of seeing or understanding the world. For Barthes, connotations of a sign are more important than its denotation. Meaning and our understanding of meaning are always encoded within signs. Connotations are determined by the codes to which the interpreter has access. Meaning is part of a codified system. The cultural codes we find ourselves in are not innocent. They are tied up with specific interests of the interests of specific groups. Meanings are tied up with relations of power. More specifically for Barthes, cultural codes are ideological. Semiology, the study of signs, can uncover the ideological dimension of signs in popular culture. And he goes on to say, I'm therefore again faced with a greater semiological system. There is a signifier already formed within a previous system. There is a signified. There is a presence of the signified through the signifier. Myth has a double function. It points out and it notifies. It makes us understand something and it imposes upon us. So what we're moving from is a simple notion of meaning and understanding to the relations of power, which are inevitably tied up with it, according to Barth. The manner in which signs are imposed upon us indicates the operations of ideology. We seem to be a long way from our friend Whitehead with his when Barth's talking about codes, systems, power, ideology. In one sense we are, but in another sense I feel we're quite close to elements of chapter 3 of Symbolism. For example, signs, meaning and society are closely linked. The quotation I've just given you from Roland Barthes comes from a description of the copy of the magazine Paris Match, which he encountered at a local barber's in the 1960s. The image on the cover is of a young black soldier saluting the French flag. Barthes reads this image as one which reinforces a specific understanding of France as an imperial nation, but one in which there is no colour discrimination, where the equality of the French Revolution is extended to all those citizens of the current French Empire. Whitehead agrees. He says, the appeal to the deeper side is still important in an army, although it is provided for in another set of symbols, such as the flag, which produce a general sense of the importance of the duties performed. As usual, Whitehead's tone is softer than that of other writers. He neither praises nor condemns, he simply iterates. In itself, this is not a problem. I don't ask more of him. But for my purposes, we need to take his ideas on symbolism and reorient them to make us think of the world as it is now. Now, clearly, I don't think Roland Barthes the answer, but I'm pointing towards his link between signs, meaning, and understanding. I'm going to jump ahead. Taking the contemporary world as mythical, we can unpack how specific social and historical elements are passed off as natural. Barthes says, we reach here the very principle of myth. It transforms history into nature. It is because symbolism is so widespread that it goes unnoticed. Barthes asks us, as does Whitehead, to pay more attention to the operations of symbols and meanings in the world. Barthes thinks that we can pay closer attention by constructing a specific concept of myth. Unlike usual notions of myth, for Barthes, they are not ambiguous. Myth does not deny things. On the contrary, the function is to talk about them. Simply, it purifies them. It makes them innocent. It gives them a natural justification. In passing from history to nature, myth organizes a world which is without contradictions. Things appear to mean something by themselves. It's here that the inhumanity of symbolism returns. Then now it's become a matter of the inhumanity of the social. What do I mean by this? The signs and symbols we encounter in the world are not of our own making. We make sense of the world, we understand it through signs, which themselves have gone through a process. It is a process which organizes the world so it makes sense to us, enables us to make sense of ourselves in the world. As with Whitehead, it is not that we are simply human, we become human. For Barthes, this involves the separation of ourselves from a process inherent in the making of our world, so that the world appears to be made up of things which mean something separately from us. There is a double inhumanity here. One element is that there are other things involved in the process by which we become contemporary humans. This isn't problematic for Whiteheadians. It's a founding element of his philosophy. The other, more insidious aspect of that inhumanity is that in becoming human, we separate ourselves from the things of the world. For Barthes, this process involves a passing from history to nature. As a result, we believe we inhabit a world which is innocent, pure, and without contradiction. We think that things mean things on their own terms. We downgrade the human element, the specific historical and cultural form of the things of the world. We deny the humanity involved in the world, and in doing so, limit our understanding of our own humanity. Thinking of the world as full of objects which are separate from us is, in this example, what Whitehead obviously calls bifurcation of nature. Our tacit acceptance of this limits our thoughts and actions. Now, for the Marxists among you, you'll have noticed that I'm actually talking about this is another version of Marx's concept of the fetishism of the commodity, in a sense. But I'm going to move over. And Barthes carries on. He says, bourgeois ideology turns culture into nature. Now, I like Barthes very much, but it's the reliance upon the concept of ideology which I find problematic. The advantage that Barthes' account seems to have over Whitehead is he tries to outline how signs or symbols operate at a group level and produce a specific historical contemporary form of understanding and meaning, which is, in some way, hierarchical, and that's what he uses ideology to say. This is something that Whitehead, in a weird way, does discuss in the later stages of symbolism. The immediacy of the examples produced by Barthes, such as the young black soldier from a colony, French colony, saluting a flag, are more direct and something we need to confront. But despite the subtlety of Barth's writing, the main thrust of his argument remains reliant upon a sophisticated but overarching version of ideology, which ultimately I find unhelpful. I won't go into the battle over ideology, but it's a long and difficult one. So I'm going to go from Latour to Foucault and then back to the inhumanity of the social. One of the reasons Bruno Latour likes Whitehead is he seems to Whitehead seems to agree both with Latour's critique of sociology and his advocacy of a radically different way of conceptualizing the status and operations of all things social. Latour, and on his reading, Whitehead also, rejects the deployment of any overarching explanation, be it in terms of gender, class, ethnicity, poverty, the social, or ideology. We need to pay due attention to the things of the world in their specificity. This specificity involves the relations or networks, says Latour, which comprise both what these things are and the milieu which they inhabit. If we start by assuming that we know what is social, what is gendered, that all is tainted by social class or race or by ideology, we've limited our thinking and we'll keep repeating the mistakes of the past. This is fair enough, and I don't entirely disagree with Latour. My problem lies in the way in which Latour sets up this issue. Sociologists and social theorists don't, mostly, want to rely on empty explain-all categories, but they do feel that there was and is something that these categories were trying to capture and which is still worth capturing in some sense. I think this is what I'm trying to do today, to add something to our understanding of the social world in terms of its signs and meanings, an understanding which takes account of the specificity of the things, occasions, and persons within which symbolism occurs, without reducing these phenomena to individual events. This problem, it seems to me, is not to do with reclaiming or remodelling ideology, but I do think that the ideological is something that we need to address. That's to say, we need to realise that we've given ideology, traditionally, maybe you didn't, but we did within sociology and social theory, a quasi-theological status. It is everywhere and nowhere. It underpins all that happens and explains everything, every person, and relation. Okay, so we don't simply want to denounce and reject it. We need to be careful. This is where I'm going to go from my friend Foucault, who says, I don't think that we should consider the modern state as an entity which was developed above individuals, ignoring what they are and their very existence, but as a very sophisticated structure in which individuals can be integrated and submitted to a very specific set of patterns. This may not be the most sophisticated and incisive of Foucault's statements. It tells us something about the context in which he was writing. Those Marxists, especially the Maoist members of the French Communist Party, so influential when Foucault was writing, who saw the modern state as the source of all our problems and the site of a central production or ideology, have missed their target. Worse, in doing so, they've missed out the experiences, the real lives of the people in whose name they build their critique. Foucault's trying to redress the balance. But importantly, he says there are patterns. It's the very end I'm interested in. There are patterns to experience rather than a simplistic model of a structural-based and ideological superstructure. I'm going to come back to this. Interestingly, Foucault never said that he was betraying Marx. He basically often, in his interviews, he made it clear, he says, after the publication of Discipline and Punish, I often quote concepts, texts and phrases from Marx without feeling obliged to add the authenticating label of a footnote with a laudatory phrase. But Foucault was unwary of any unthinking use of the concept of ideology. He says, sociologists hate this quote, it is quite possible that the major mechanisms of power have been accompanied by ideological productions. There has, for example, probably been an ideology of education, an ideology of a monarchy, but basically I do not believe that what has taken place can be said to be ideological. It is both much more and much less than ideology. Ideology exists, it's fine, but it's not the central problem. We should take it seriously, but not as the be-all and end-all. In itself, it does not explain what is going on, but at the same time, this is where I'm sort of disagree with Latour, it indicates that there is a problem, but is not in itself immediately indicative of what that problem is. We need to shift focus, but not lose sight of what drew us to suggest that ideology was the solution, if that makes any sense. How long have I got now? I told you I was terrible with timing.
You have about 10 minutes.
Okay. Oh, this might work then. Okay, now Raymond Williams and structures of feeling. I've tried to argue we need to reapproach, probably not very clearly, but I've tried to, it's clear in my head. We need to reapproach what led us to think that ideology was a solution. Okay. In this final section, I'll try to show how, as Foucault puts it, what concerns us is both much more and much less than ideology. This will require some conceptual work, but not a wholesale rejection of Marx or Marxism. I forgot to say, although I joked about it, I'm trying to make Whitehead a Marxist, but only temporarily, just for the sake of this paper. For fun. This is one reason I've chosen the inveterate but subtle Marxist Raymond Williams as my starting point. Raymond Williams, 1921 to 1988, who, as Stephen pointed out to me yesterday, was hugely influenced by Empson. Is that right, Stephen?
Yes, it's still right.
Good. Was an important Marxist cultural theorist and historian. In his book, Marxism and Literature, Williams sets out to talk about what he calls structures of feeling. His move is to suggest that this notion is designed to avoid the tendency in cultural and social analysis to talk of culture in the past. He says this always involves the conversion of experience into finished products. So we're always talking about what happens. Culture is what has happened. Okay. Treating culture and society as things which are past means that we treat them as completed wholes. According to Williams, this misses out a vital aspect of culture and the social, namely that it's active and ongoing. He says we look for form wholes rather than forming and formative processes. The tasks he sets himself is to... Did I not put this on PowerPoint? I'm really sorry I didn't. Yes, I did. Find other terms for the undeniable experience of the present, not only the temporal present, the realization of this and this instant, but the specificity of present being, the inalienably physical, within which we may indeed discern and acknowledge institutions, formations, positions, but not always as fixed products, defining products. There is a need to account for how we are, what we are now, and what we are becoming. We need to be able to account, maybe even describe, process. This does not mean falling into relativity or any notion of continuous becoming. I disagree with you. Within the present, we can still discern wider aspects which suffuse our present experience, and elements of this are inalienably physical. They're bodily too. The term that William chooses to describe this process is structures of feeling. I think there are clear resonances with elements of Whitehead's work here. One useful difference... Williams is concerned to account for what I've so far been tentatively putting under the banner of ideology, but in a manner which is less rigid than that of Barth. Feeling is chosen to emphasize a distinction... He says, feeling is chosen, he chooses the word structures of feeling, to emphasize a distinction from the more formal concepts of worldview or ideology. Through his phrase, structures of feeling, Williams is trying to get at a kind of feeling and thinking which is indeed social and material, but each in an embryonic phase before it can become fully articulate and defined exchange. He's not presupposed what is social about such feeling. Williams has not made them reliant upon human consciousness or imagination. The feelings involved are material, yet they are coming to be. Their active status rather than their settled character is what makes them important. Such feelings can be identified by a particular quality of social experience and relationship, historically distinct from other particular qualities. For the Marxists amongst you, that's an example of historical materialism. So, there's a quality to the feeling of capitalism which makes it distinct from the feelings of other epochs. Under capitalism, there is a tendency for our feelings to manifest a specific quality. It is not a form of economic reductionism, I would argue. Feelings are not ideological productions which are somehow produced by the dominant class, or the 1%, forcing the rest of us, the so-called 99%, to think and feel in a specific way, a way that does not benefit us but keeps us in a place. This is where I think it's important to return to Whitehead's approach and to use him to defend Williams from the charge of advocating a traditional Marxist position. Feelings are real. They are an element of the process by which we become what we are. Feelings make us what we are by incorporating elements of other things, of what we are not, into what we are now. There is, again, an aspect of what I call the inhumanity of symbolism. What is specific about symbolism is it puts us in the realm of meaning. We are concerned, as Williams puts it, with meanings and values as they are actively lived and felt within a specific historical epoch. Put briefly, the following of one experience by another, as Keith pointed out, makes the form of a symbol and the latter the meaning. Such meaning is located not in our minds, but not just in our minds, but in our bodies, our actions. This is the role of causal efficacy, which I don't have time to discuss here. Instead, I'll jump ahead. Williams makes it clear that in place of structures of feeling, an alternative definition would be, as he says, structures of experience. The overlap between feeling and experience is one which is useful when approaching the topic from a Whiteheadian stance. There's also a link to Whitehead's discussion of confirmation as set out in Symbolism. Whitehead's approach here has always seemed to me to fit nicely with Marx's assertion that men, make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past. There is a creativity involved in all that we do, but not an unfettered creativity. We need to distinguish between general and real potentiality. Now, in Symbolism, to my mind, confirmation takes on the role of real potentiality. We must pay attention to the part played by the past in the present. It provides a ground from which we and our world arise, but it is not a purely determining ground. Extensive continuum. It is in this vein that we can read Williams's account of the changes in structures of feeling from one epoch to another, which he describes as changes of presence. Although they are emergent or pre-emergent, they do not have to await definition, classification, or rationalization before they exert palpable pressures and set effective limits on experience and on action. Confirmation, to my mind, becomes the palpable pressures which we experience and which sets the limits for our actions and in the world. Components of experience and of feeling are not structureless, but nor are they structureful. I'm going to jump ahead. Post-structuralists, we know that reducing something to a structure, so it's strange, although Williams is talking about structures of feeling, I don't want them to be structures. Actually, to jump ahead, I'll just keep talking, I'll stop interrupting myself. There is a move from potentiality into actuality, a unity of experience. Transformation involves intensification, changes of attention from which other elements of experience may arise. Okay, this is all to do with symbolism. Whitehead's provided a neat philosophical account. Why do I keep comparing his work to Williams? Is it just a matter of an interesting similarity between their arguments? Obviously, I don't think so. I think Williams' contribution can be formed. Yet we are also defining social experience which is still in process, often indeed not yet recognised as social, but taken to be private, idiosyncratic, and even isolating. Right, I've only got a minute. Whitehead rarely uses the word hierarchy, though he does intriguingly mention a hierarchy of categories of feeling in Process and Reality, page 166. Williams is much more interested in such things and in the dominant characteristics which accompanied them. This reminds us of his Marxism, but it's a Marxism of a specific kind, one where the feelings and experience involved in such hierarchies are still in process. This mention of hierarchies brings us back to ideology, or seems to. This is something that Williams recognises but wants to keep distance from. He says his argument is not about casting off ideology or learning phrases about it, but confronting the fibres of the self in the hard practical substance of effective and continuing relationships. I wish I'd put that quote up, it's lovely. In the discussion of Foucault, ideology is distracting. It embroils people in terms of trying to throw it off or indulge in complex arguments about it. Okay, honestly. For Whitehead, ultimately, there we go. Ultimately, I want to argue, probably against Latour, but certainly with Whitehead, that there is an inhumanity involved in the process by which we become human. If, like Latour, we focus on individual items, we run the risk of not seeing what I want to call the patterns of lumpiness which constitute existence. For Whitehead, such unevenness is a necessary aspect of the metaphysical account of existence. For Raymond Williams, there is evidence of specific lumpiness in our contemporary culture. To my mind, William enables us to make a more specific point than Whitehead, namely that under capitalism, there's a very peculiar aspect of inhumanity involved in making us human. There is an unevenness to the symbols and meanings which make us what we are. This unevenness is implicated in and sustained by the processes of capitalism. We require symbols to become what we are, Symbolism always involves an element of inhumanity. The specific operations of capitalism involve making one possible aspect of humanity an element within the inhumanity which makes us what we are today.
Time for questions. Jeff.
I love that phrase, patterns of lumpiness. I mean, I guess to play devil's advocate with Latour and his pasteurizing France book, when he talks about microorganisms, there's a certain pattern of relations that microorganisms enter into us in many ways, from pasteurized milk to various other things. So it's as a result of this sort of reaffirming associations of these patterns that leads us to say there really are these microorganisms. I'm being very simplistic. How does that contrast with the patterns of lumpiness that you say? How is that not a pattern of lumpiness?
It is, and he's right. I mean, this is where, there are so many similarities and agreements.
Okay.
Where he would come in and strike me down is by linking it to this thing called capitalism, and saying, and there are hierarchies within that. And he'd say, but you've just done a catch-all, explain-all category.
I see.
I mean, you allow yourself, Stephen in a conversation said, you allow yourself capitalism as your fetish, as the existence of capitalism. I don't think capitalism exists, but I think that as a thing,
I think capital exists.
I think it exists as a way of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people talk about effective capitalism, this is actually partly what I'm disagreeing with, is sometimes the way that people talk about effective capitalism. This is part of the unevenness of the feeling which constitutes what we are under capitalism. But that's the kind of thing that I want to say that Latour would just say you're not allowed to.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's exactly a question, but I actually felt the two papers resonated usefully for me. And I just want to say something maybe about the links in which they do. Which I think has to do with affect theory, which has increasingly been used in both literature and on the humanities and in social sciences in recent years. And affect theory is drawn from various sources. A lot of it comes from Deleuze and Spinoza, and the way people like Brian Massumi have translated that. Another aspect comes maybe through Eve Sedgwick from Sylvan Tompkins and his sort of cybernetic rewriting of Freud in a way that gives more role to affect. But I've always felt that there's a lot of potential in affect theory, but that I was never completely satisfied with the way anybody articulated it. However, I think both papers sort of suggested how Whitehead, and I mean, Whitehead doesn't use the word affect, he talks about feeling, but he also says it's a mere technical term, but feeling as a mere technical term seems to be to get at what Brian Massumi means when he talks about differentiating between affect and emotion. And I mean, there are all kinds of issues, I think, which Whitehead directly addresses, even though he wasn't aware that these issues would come up. Okay. But I sort of thought that both papers sort of contributed to, I mean, another way to put this, and this may be just too idiosyncratic to me, is that my sense of affect theory is that affect theory is basically Spinozistic, and what we need in this area, as in many others, is a Whiteheadian modification of Spinoza. And I kind of see that coming up both in the way Michael calls on Raymond Williams, whose structures of feeling. I've always been puzzled why that phrase is used more in affect theory, since it seems to be directly a way to get away from the overly cognitive aspects of ideology and to really grasp that. And also, Catherine, what you're doing through Connolly as a way of thinking about these different kinds of alignments, which have to be affective alignments. I mean, it's not a cognitive problem. It's not that if you only could explain, it's like too many people seem to think if you only could really explain how the climate works, then all these, right-wingers would immediately understand and embrace climate change. But that's obviously not the thing. It obviously is an affective formation. I mean, the Koch brothers want to increase global warming because it increases their profit margin. But people who support their agenda are doing so for affective reasons, which have to do with the way symbolism is tied in with feelings and how they're structured of feelings in the sense Michael did. And so in other words, I'm just saying that from my point of view, both papers seem to be pointing towards what I see as an important way of rethinking, utilizing, but maybe subtly modifying affect theory as a way of dealing with all these world problems. So that may not be a question, but.
Well, it's an important contribution, and I'm curious about getting to know the wider range of affect theories. You know, Sarah Achman's notion of of being an affect alien seems to capture something about a position of resistance that one is embodying, one is thrown into, that may give rise to alternative forms of action, but that has interesting kinships to the queer art of failure as well, and therefore learning from that failure. I'm interested in drawing that queer art of failure coming out of Halberstam into a more environmental understanding of our failure, and our failure is no excuse. So this sort of sense of being affect aliens may be helpful. But yes, I think also Connolly's work together with his partner Jane Bennett on themes of affect and vitality, now linked into just the vitality of things, the vitality of matter, but the universe of things as understood right as the fragility of things is very rich and ties into his deployment of Deleuzianism, I think perhaps in a less sheerly Spinozist way than one might expect, but working through the notion of the resonance machine and resonances that even forms of spiritual practice, theistic or atheistic, non-theistic, can generate is hopeful politically, in as much as it suggests a way that new forms of alliance, depending also on practices of self-cultivation, that is, attention to our affective life, can have systemic implications. Because, of course, the danger of the turn to affect theory is just a new preoccupation with our rich life of feelings and all of its aesthetic and psychological gradients, all of which are very important, but which can begin to suck energy away from political projects. But I do agree with the need that Michael has traced also of resisting any simplistic notion of ideology. Ideology is misplaced concreteness. Yeah, that's lovely. It's all more than and less than ideology, and maybe affect theory is a way of naming both that more and that less.
I mean, I think part of it is, this is something which has come up in a lot in Brian Masumi's work. He wrote an earlier book on Reagan, and I mean, what affect theory is basically saying, I think, is that Americans loved Reagan even though they totally disagreed cognitively with every aspect of his ideology, and they embraced him. And we have to realize this is some kind of affective work which is going on. Yeah. And it has to be countered affectively, not just by rational arguments. I'm not against rational arguments, but they're not going to be have causal efficacy in these situations.
Kind of along those lines, I just want to offer a comment in response to Catherine's paper. When Katrina hit the Gulf Coast, I remember that initially I almost was so numb from the scale of it that I could not have a response to it until I saw on the news one man being interviewed who related the story of him being up, trying to get away from the water in their attic with his wife and holding on to her as the water rose, and then her being washed away. And that touched me so deeply because it was such a personal, real, it made the whole scale of enormity of it become very real. And in the looking at climate change and the environmental crisis that faces us, I feel like every time I hear somebody, whether it's Al Gore or anybody else, say that, or President Obama, that we need to act to avoid climate change, I want to scream, because it reminds me of when I worked in marketing and software, and it would be so frustrating to work with salespeople who always wanted to talk about the features and not the benefits. Because avoiding climate change is not anything anybody wants to do in and of itself. And so I feel like if we, like you all are saying about affect theory, if we want people to act in novel ways and to respond differently to this crisis, then we need a lure for feeling. And so to me, it's story, art, poetry, maybe even a new mythos that needs to be created that are lures to allow, and so maybe this to me is more, it's so much less about reason than it is about love and beauty. And I wonder if our efforts need to be put more into stating these things, first of all, in ways that say, we're not just trying to avoid climate change, we're trying to avoid the complete destruction of all mammalian life on this planet. And like, do we want to have life continue is more the question, amongst many other questions. But I just want to throw out there that I think reason and arguments, like has already been said, are not going to fix this problem, aren't going to change people's perceptions of the weather because they're so stuck in their ideology, but maybe new stories, new things that people can fall in love with about the Earth might make some changes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a reasonable argument, right? We're not going to accomplish a damn thing without the best reason we can muster, but I agree, we're also not going to get anywhere without stories. I just suspect they're going to have to be stories tailored for different communities, and the sort of passionate expressions, like this isn't about just climate change, global warming, this is about the future of life on the planet. That works for us, that totally shuts down the audience that needs to be gotten to, because they recognize this ideology, propaganda. So a lot of our passion isn't going to cross over. It's not crossing over, however well storied it is. So there's a careful framing of stories that probably going to need to work within the particular political framework. So appeals to forms of production and local agriculture that really help American workers, for instance, is one strategy that shows some effects, to the local in ways that appeal to forms of nationalism might be crucial for some kinds of polity. I mean, some really unsavory mixed discourses might be necessary. But there are other kinds of beautiful stories that seem to have a pull. I'm not sure that it's a pull that goes beyond the already at least democratic public, but like of the all the work of the New Universe story, which has a rough relationship to process thought. But I admire very much what Mary Evelyn Tucker is doing, putting that gorgeous film on it. That travels into a lot of communities and it's working with great beauty about the cosmos. So I think there are multiple narrative strategies, aesthetic strategies that we need to work at, but a lot of them, I guess, are just going to reassure ourselves and to energize our own public. So the question is how to get at I guess it's the swing vote public that is.
I bring up the Katrina point because maybe it's partly about making it very much more personal.
I have a funny feeling, and it seems to me that framing the question in terms of the environment and it hasn't worked. We don't need to invent new stories. I think we're going to do it in just like Al Capone got done for tax evasion.
Yeah.
I would say that if you want to sort out the environment, make companies pay tax and bring in not just a minimum wage, but a living wage. So it's actually making not just, you make a different argument and the effects will be maybe what we want.
But that's already a radical argument. It will require quite a social breakdown to be heard.
Well, no, but interestingly, in the fact that in London, where I'm from, that actually they've said look, the minimum wage isn't enough, and we're now shaming people into paying a living wage, which is about £9 an hour, so whatever, $14. This is a localised you know, insofar as London is localised, you know, but this is a good argument.
Yep, it's a good argument.
And ultimately, because what we're talking about, as Stephen pointed out, and this is where Bruno Latour would again come and hit me on the head and say, issues to do with climate change. People make money out of climate change. You know, so you know, and oil companies, whatever. You know, so until we address that kind of issue, but one way of doing that is actually by making them pay tax, not changing international regulations in terms of setting up offshore companies, etc., you know, and where the flows of capital go, and making them pay their workers around the world, wherever they be, a decent wage. This would be sort of my way.
Of course, the trouble is, I mean, it's sort of like some of the commentary on Thomas Piketty's Capital of the 21st Century, where he proposes, you know, a worldwide tax on wealth. And the most sensible response I've seen to that is to say, of course, Piketty's entirely right, except how do you pass a worldwide tax on wealth? And can I say one other thing, which is just, maybe this is just because I'm such an ironist or whatever, but it struck me when he was saying that maybe the most effective strategy is not to tell people all mammalian life on this planet will be extinct. They'll say, well, rats will really survive. They'll find something else to eat when they don't have our garbage anymore. And that might show
or your pet dogs will die. You know, that's the way to do it. They couldn't give a shit about, you know, like the lemur and thing. That little poodle which you spend $200, you know, getting like, it's going to die. This is what I mean about localised, you know, forms of argument. You actually need to completely shift the perspective, because people don't give a shit about the environment as a global thing. They just don't. It's not work. I keep thinking of Planet of the Apes. You know, the end. You know, because we did have these forms of arguments in the 70s and 80s, I believe. You know, when you're on against nuclear war, and you know, in the UK we had brilliant films about, you know, the catastrophe and what it would be like. You know. Didn't work. Nobody came. Nobody, you know. Oh my God! You know, it's like saying to the politicians, "Really? That's what nuclear holocaust looks like?" I'll tell you what. We'll take down the weapons. That's not how it. That's not how it worked. And I have a funny feeling that, you know, the same with climate change. It's not about getting David Attenborough to stand up. You know, David Attenborough, the BBC presenting, and saying, oh, "Isn't it awful?"
And then you hear about the right-wing fundamentalists who believe that the environmental crisis is the apocalypse, and so they're looking forward to it.
Yeah, I suspect we need to use some apocalypse language, just because...
Well, I'll just say very quickly, I'm just thinking about some of the stuff also that I was talking about yesterday. I wonder if part of what's involved here, right, and the conversation just occurred here, within a certain interpretation of Whitehead, right, where all the action that we had, that Whitehead's God has any interest in, right, is at the level of the actual occasions, so that the pragmatic approach here would be to try to get at the actual occasions rather than at the people, because you can't persuade the people. Because they're already set in their ways. I mean, to a certain extent. They may change, but they won't necessarily change. Again, you have to get to the structures of feeling rather than to the self-conscious level. So I'm just wondering if that's something that, in fact, both of your, the level of humanity and Connolly's new Whiteheadian. And the flip side of that, of course, is the extent to which, in somebody like Williams, you may have lurking, right, this sort of Whiteheadian history, given his own education.
I have a funny feeling.
And the like, but it's working effectively because it comes across as more idiosyncratic than. So I'm just wondering if this is one of the takeaways.
I mean, something I've been thinking about the last couple of days, I'm going to reply obliquely, is a distinction between reason and reasons. So actual entities are the only reasons. So if we're at that level. And our reasoning about it won't change what they think. And you know, reason less powerful than we think, and it's not the same as reasons. You know, people are looking for the reasons why, you know, what are the reasons why people don't all come together and, you know, protest against climate change? That's not actually where the reasons are. The reasons are the actual entity. So is that an oblique enough for you?
Well, I mean, sorry. This sort of reminds me of, and I can't help think about something we were talking about yesterday in relationship to my paper, I guess, is the problem why it's not working is, it seems to me, has everything to do with this idea of the common world, right? This common world is what we share and we want to fight for, but it's precisely what's not working as part of the argument, right? That the common is something we can't appeal to as a reason.
I mean, I was interested, you know, the person that you, I'm not going to ask, I'm going to suggest, because we don't share the world in common, and it's a bit like, I'll just say what I'm going to say. The person you saw experiencing Katrina, if they weren't what we would call a black person in Britain, then in terms of the actual effect that it had, you know, it predominantly, it was affecting black people. It was to do with poverty. It was, you know, it's not like there was a natural disaster which just came and there was a whole history. This is partly what I'm trying to get at. You know, so people in, where was it? New Orleans, didn't share it in common. There was a lumpiness to existence, you know, in New Orleans, which played out in terms of people's experience of a so-called natural disaster, which was natural, you know, because of their positions and history and poverty, etc. It affected certain people in terms of, you know, their race and ethnicity more than others. We don't share the world in common.
Well, sorry.
I mean, philosophically, metaphysically, we do. It's a good metaphysical point. Our world is not.
I think you brought in the quote from Whitehead, where he has the peculiar term, community of natures. Mm-hmm. Right? In their community of natures. He doesn't think their relationality or something, in their community of natures. And he goes on to say, this quote, which you didn't quote, which has not to be shared by symbolism, by symbolic reference.
Okay.
So there's obviously a community that is not recognized, and we have not symbolized it, or not just we haven't, but the symbolization needs not to happen. It can happen in very different localized ways.
Yeah. So I mean, this is
so there is still the community as the basis for it, and that's what you have brought in several times.
Yeah.
It is still provided the basis.
Well, to save the community, you can't talk about the common. I mean, maybe that's just why Deleuze
no, it's you haven't symbolized.
I might go the other way around on that.
That's the point. For Whitehead, it's there as the basis for any kind of symbolization or the failure of symbolization. But you have to symbolize it, and you can only do that locally. I think I agree on that in differentiated ways. Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to. What occurred to me, is particularly in listening to Catherine's presentation, is the discontinuity in life that we often don't take into account when we have this image of the frog gradually boiling and dying. In my experience, it would be December 7th, 1941. You have a certain political situation where isolationism prevails in the United States. Suddenly, everything changes. I think that kind of thing may break in here. And then the symbolism suddenly clicks into place in a way that we don't see happening.
Mm-hmm. And that's what certain notions of the common or of the person can mute.
I think we've got two final questions then, and then we'll wrap it up. I think, Philip.
So I'd like to ask the two speakers whether you find concrete resources in Whitehead for addressing this issue. Both of you speak of failure and seek hopeful responses. Catherine, you speak of the failure of the slowness of symbols and their apparent refusal, at least in the short term, to conform, though you have an optimistic note at the end. And Michael speaks, quickly left Whitehead out of a failure, page 8, right? And then had a sort of failure of Marx and Marxism, you know, may they pass so that Marxist activism may succeed, maybe with your point later on. But the discussion seems to point back to Whitehead in a more positive way as we see concrete, embodied, symbolizing or symbolic communities. And so I sort of want to go back to the text and ask, at the end of this conversation, do you find something positive in that hope that you look for, opposed to the failure that you proclaim?
I mean, do you want, I'll very quickly. Yes and no, because the reason I'm here is because I love Whitehead and I think he offers us a lot of things, but then he gives us no answers. And we have to go and make the answers. We have to actually go and do the work.
So not even a framework that's useful?
No.
Right. That's the right Marxist response.
But I think it's a tremendous gift to us from him that he makes us go back and do the work. Right? And there is some way that the process is just going to keep going, and we're going to keep creating our worlds, whether we give up in nihilistic hopelessness, you know, for very good reasons, or, you know, whether we pretend to forms of hope that we think maybe someone else will believe, even though we secretly know we're just being propagandistic, you know, or whether we actually are finding some stories and some energies through networks of action, of activity that we are part of, and that are beginning to find zones of resonance with other movements, groups. I mean, that's where I find hope in Whitehead's quite radical and cosmological pluralism, that really there's no excuse to stop, because even our stopping is going to reproduce itself, you know, immortally. Eternally, it will recur. So why not instead ride some of the potentialities that our symbolic references do certainly make available, even in and through often apocalyptic symbols. So no, I don't think there's a structure that Whitehead can give us for the present moment, but I think the cosmology now is indispensable for articulating a kind of cosmopolitan politics with cosmos, a planetary politics.
So I'm not sure I qualify as Whiteheadian, but I actually am deeply drawn to the account that came through in both of your papers of this, especially, Catherine, your idea of the rapidly arising conformal symbols.
Yeah, the arrow.
And I feel like I'm seeing that in the younger environmental movement as people focus on eco-villages and sustainable communities, and begin doing a rapid production of symbols. As quickly as after December 7th, there was a change, maybe in a dark direction. So here I see the arising of symbol systems in local communities in ways that seem to me well described by Whitehead's text.
They're arising, and they are getting together, as that climate march demonstrated, and they dissipate again. But there's a serious chance that there can be enough frustration and enough satisfaction in these new assemblages that there could be a criticality, a turning point. Yeah.
And we would need great storytellers who can actually weave the black spider woman. Weave the story of the plight of American workers who were losing jobs to oversee exports. With the story of the universe told by someone like Maria Blantanca and Brian Swim, how we can make this story layered, so that if you're passionately attached to one story, then you kind of get the rest of the story too. Kind of look at you.
I think we can just squeeze in your question.
Okay. Fine.
You sure? Okay.
Now we really.
All right. Well,
what struck me is kind of odd. Having witnessed from a peculiar perspective the rise of a particular kind of neoliberal discourse. I was in law school at the University of Chicago when the law and economics movement crashed on us like a wave, and suddenly everything was about, it was a rather nicer utilitarian version of it then. But one of the things that struck me is that that discourse immediately became associated with prestige. And the whole school's prestige arose. And you couldn't engage in any other kind of discourse and get any attention. I mean, some of the people who were older faculty, who were still in the Harvard Process School of Jurisprudence, boy, they faded like nothing. I mean, it was suddenly, you couldn't be associated with them. You couldn't get any, any help. And you mentioned mixed discourses that have some very negative aspects to them, but which do take over, and which would, I was thinking of the fact that I saw a film one time about where the final scene was the kind of anomic figure getting into uniform and marching in a unit of soldiers, putting on the tunic, and the thing was that suddenly becoming cannon fodder had prestige to it somehow. I mean, huge prestige. This is very skilled people in Hollywood making these films to persuade people to go and get blown up.
Yep.
I once thought about trying to promote an ecology chic, a prestige.
Green prestige,
discourse.
right?
Yeah, green prestige. And frankly, I can't make it work in my mind. But
the ancient sense of prestige, is magic.
Yeah.
And maybe it's akin to what Whitehead means by importance. And maybe we
Well, I think it's
charge
a
up an
subset of
alternative.
importance, of Whiteheadian importance. I mean, he did go to Harvard.
I mean, just very quickly, to agree with Latour, I'm not against, although Latour might not say this, I'm quite happy with propaganda. You just need to be better propagandists.
Yeah.
Stop being reasonable.
Can you avoid propaganda?
No, take it, run with it,
It works and it's good.
Yeah.
Cool, but
Stop being reasonable
so often
and
we
nice
hardly
and
believe
trying to
it
convince
ourselves.
people.
You never had a ministry for propaganda, right?
The BBC.
It is the BBC.
The BBC.
As the Scots.
It is, no, the BBC is a propagandist, which is fine.
Sure.
It's a specific version.
Sure.
It's not, innocent, liberal, lovely. I mean, that is its propaganda. But it's detached, objective, liberal, educated, read white, read middle class, read male.
And it's effective.
That's the BBC, and it's brilliant. I love it.
And beautiful.
Yeah.
Got the Guardian on my phone.
Yeah.
Okay,
Same thing.
once again, let's thank our two speakers.